Class as analytical category in classics. In this short talk, I inquire into the relationship between classics and the phenomenon and vocabulary relating to social class. And then I outline some issues relating to the neglect of class as an analytical category by classicists and scholars of classical reception. In 1736, we find the first use of the term class in its modern socio-economic sense being used alongside classics in the English language writing. The social distinction here is between two types of British people prosperous enough to purchase their sons an education. It's imperative that we keep in mind that nearly half the children of Britain, 2 million, were given even a rudimentary schooling only by the passing of the Elementary Education Act in 1870. But a Georgian polemicist named Stonehouse questions the point of boys spending most of the hours available for education on acquiring proficiency in the ancient Mediterranean languages, when reading relevant material, he says, had a much more obvious application to the aspiring businessman. Teachers are as capable of contributing to the welfare or prejudice of a state as any of the several classes of men of which it is composed. Learning Latin, especially how to compose verses in Latin, inculcates no skills useful to commerce. Better to read newspapers instead. Several famous writers spell and write English perfectly, better than others who've read the classics, though they're quite ignorant of Latin. Now, neither term had ever been used in such a sense a mere 60 years earlier. Classics, as a distinct curriculum under that name, comprising the study of Latin and Greek authors in their original languages, with complementary publications relating to classical history, religion, myth, geography, artefacts and antiquities, that emerged in England after 1707, called Britain, between the 1670s and about 1715. And the invention of classics therefore took place in a social context where the power of the monarchy had been curtailed by the Bill of Rights 1689, and the power of the nobility was being challenged by an ambitious mercantile middle class. It's in 1684 that the classics first occurs, meaning ancient authors, certainly including now Greek ones, as studied by well-to-do junior males. It appears in an English translation of Eutropius's Breviarium Historiae Romanae, and its authorship was credited to several young gentlemen privately educated in Hatton Garden. So why were these authors called the classics? When the Romans heard their Latin noun classis, it contained a resonance that we do not hear when we say class. Deriving from the same root as the verb clamare, call out, a classis consisted of a group of people called out or summoned together by trumpets. The word has always been associated with Servius Tullius, the sixth of the legendary kings of early Rome, who was thought to have held the first census in order to find out for the purposes of military finances what assets his people possessed. That's in Livy. By the second third of the 18th century, the term was adopted in order to distinguish different strata within English society. But it's to the legendary first census that the origins of the term classics must also be traced. In Servius' scheme, the men in the top of his 6 classes, the men with the most money and property, were called the classici. The top men were classics. And by the time of the late 2nd century CE Roman miscellanist Aulus Gellius, these top authors could also, by metaphorical extension, be called classic authors, scriptores classici, to distinguish them from inferior or, metaphorically, proletarian authors, scriptores proletarii, that's in Noctes Attici. The involvement historically of the study of Greece and Rome with the maintenance of socio-economic hierarchies is thus transparent in the label classics. The term class acquired its precise modern sense slightly later than classics, but as we've seen, by the mid-1730s it sprang naturally enough to the mind of an author discussing the appropriate education for the male offspring of Britons with means. Yet using class as an analytical category investigating classical antiquity is still a controversial procedure, as the need for this important conference attests. But this is very strange. After all, the knee-jerk derision of Marxist aesthetics, which characterised the Cold War, is no longer compulsory within the Western Academy. Marxist aesthetics did take some time to achieve sophistication, because there was an aboriginal gap in classical Marxist theory when it comes to aesthetics, for the simple reason that Marx, Engels and their immediate successors were far too busy addressing class struggle on the economic and political planes to work out a fully fledged theory of art. In the Soviet bloc, there was an early flowering of brilliant work marrying sociolinguistics to a historically materialist approach to literature, and that's evidenced in the work of scholars like Mikhail Bakhtin, who engaged deeply with classical texts, especially the ancient novel and Menippean satire, and Olga Freidenberg, another novel specialist. But sadly, this radical synthesis of materialism, formalism and linguistics was all too soon displaced by the problematic and inflexible doctrines of socialist realism. But sophisticated models of reading literature with a dialectical materialist class-based approach were in due course developed by a succession of brilliant Western Marxist thinkers and Marxism-influenced literary theorists, including, to name only a few of the most important, Georgy Lukács, Antonio Gramsci, Walter Benjamin, Christopher Caldwell, Ernst Bloch, Sebastiano Timpanaro, Raymond Williams, Frederick Jameson, Louis Althusser, Pierre Bourdieu and Terry Eagleton. Among classicists, however, the disciplinary chasm yawning at institutional and curricular levels between ancient history and classical philology led to a curious situation in which Marxism achieved a degree of respectability among practitioners of the former while facing almost total ignorance at best and derision amongst the latter. Well-known classicists whose Marxism was relatively public knowledge included the Irish Benjamin Farrington, an expert in the history of science, whose best-known work was Head and Hand in Ancient Greece, 4 Studies in the Social Relations of Thought. Another was the Scottish Byzantinist Robert Browning, and of course English Polybius specialist F.W. Wallbank. But the exclusion of literature and aesthetics from Marxist analysis within classics was painfully apparent in the 1975 Arethusa volume edited by J.P. Sullivan, entitled Marxism and the Classics. Its contents would have been much more appropriately packaged as Marxism and Ancient History, since the articles offered purely historical perspectives on history, slavery and revolution. These included one by David Constant, who has, however, subsequently used Marxist ideas, mostly in a subterranean and non-explicit way, to illuminate ancient literary texts, above all in his Greek comedy and ideology. The sole exception in that collection was a short piece by Heinrich von Staden on Marx's own famous but truncated discussion of Greek visual art. There was silence on the topic of literary aesthetics, a pattern repeated in the extended bibliographical section. Now, the lack of hermeneutic equipment that Marxist classicists possessed to address aesthetic questions was made even more painfully apparent in Geoffrey de Santa Croix's pioneering the class struggle in the ancient Greek world. This includes chapter titles informed by the traditional communist tripartite division of the arenas in which class struggle is manifested: political, economic and ideological. The chapter The Class Struggle on the Ideological Plane, one of the shortest in the book, glances at the Thyestes in the Iliad, expresses regret that de Santa Croix cannot use Aristophanes. One is tempted to ask him to explain more clearly why not. But otherwise, he doggedly uses ancient texts to document reality. Texts like Xenophon, Plato, Aristotle, Sallust, Strabo and the Christian Fathers. He makes no attempt to decode the ideological work done by imaginative fictions as recorded in tragedy, lyric, elegy, epic, epyllion, epigram or the novel. So who've been the equivalents of Gramsci, Williams and Jameson and Terry Eagleton in the sphere of classics? Maverick Australian Jack Lindsay held pioneering opinions on the ideological work done by ancient mime and fiction, and he worked hard to draw attention to ancient literature which focused on quotidian and low-life elements in ancient society. But it was very easy for establishment scholars to keep him away from mainstream scholarship because he'd never actually held an academic position. British communist George Thompson pioneered an approach to Greek literature based on ritual anthropology, especially in his Aeschylus and Athens, a study in the social origins of drama, which was very influential in the Eastern Bloc. His best work, in my view, was, however, on the relationship between the invention of coinage and early philosophy, and the connection between metrical forms and collective labour. A few brave Italian Hellenists, notably Vincenzo Citti, Vincenzo Di Benedetto and Alessandro Liami, followed their compatriot Gramsci's lead and worked hard to demonstrate how classical texts reflected and produced the hegemonic ideological structures of the classical city. In France, the work of Vernon and, to a rather lesser extent, Vidal-Naquet fused a typically French anti-humanist Marxism with Althusserian structuralism in their pioneering readings of Greek myth, thought and literature. In the Anglophone world, however, there was an almost deafening silence until the publication of Peter W. Rose's brilliant Sons of the Gods, Children of Earth ideology and literary form in ancient Greece. Now, it's no coincidence that this sophisticated Marxist class-based study came out in 1992, 3 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall rather than before. Rose's career had actually suffered a lot on account of his socialist politics, and he'd earlier faced considerable problems when he approached publishers. It was the intervention of David Constant, then at Cornell, which led to the book's acceptance by Cornell University Press. Now, I agitated until I was allowed to review the book for the Classical Review, and I stand by everything I wrote at the time in 1993. This book provides, at last, a reliable and substantial study in English of ancient literature from an explicitly class-based Marxist perspective. The most useful chapter is undoubtedly the lengthy introduction, Marxism and the Classics, in which Rose lucidly explains his theoretical position, sophisticated amalgam of 20th century Western Marxist insights, concepts and arguments, all of which are familiar to scholars of later literatures, but which remain embarrassingly beyond the parameters of mainstream classical scholarship. From Gramsci, Rose adopts the concept of hegemonic discourse. From Bakhtin, his politics of forms, a conviction that the conventions of literary form carry an ideologically loaded message, inextricable from content. From Althusser, he gets a Marxist historicising of Freudian psychoanalytical theory, and above all from Frederick Jameson, the bearer to an Anglophone readership of all the insights of the Frankfurt School, the notion of a Marxist double hermeneutic. Literature is no crude reflection of contemporary society or simple weapon in the ideological armoury of the ruling class. It's a form of cultural production, aesthetically realising, by a process of mediation, problematization and distortion, a process, of course, conditioned by innumerable factors such as the class outlook of the poet, his relationship to the ruling class, and the formal dictates of his genre, a history of unceasing social struggle, contradiction and dialogue. Sadly, class analysis continues 30 years later to get bashed routinely in the academy. New materialists have led the most recent charge. One aspect of new materialist aesthetic analysis that classicists, I think, would do very well to resist is its retreat from, indeed often refutation, of the relationship between work and matter, what Marxists call the labour theory of value. Many of the most prominent new materialists, for example Maurizio Boscagli in Stuff Theory, Everyday Objects, Radical Materialism, They go out of their way to position their arguments as a rebuttal, or at least adversarial rival, of Marxist cultural theory. The much lauded Jane Bennett has openly and explicitly differentiated her own understanding of the M word from that of the intellectuals working in historical and dialectical materialist traditions. I want, she said, to emphasise, even overemphasise, the contributions of non-human forces in an attempt to counter the narcissistic reflex of human language and thought. What counts as the material of vital materialism? Is it only human labour and the socio-economic entities made by men and women using raw materials? Bennett's intellectual wriggling here is complex. Human subjects need to be downgraded, she says, in our appreciation of matter. Matter and objects have a vitality, instrumentality, and, it is implied, almost conscious agency of their own. We as humans are narcissists, cosmic imperialists, who by imposing subject-object hierarchies somehow oppress inorganic elements, minerals, liquids and gases, as well as organic flora and fauna, at least if we don't acknowledge that their immanence and vitality is something independent. And human labour and socio-economic entities have, Bennett implies, unfairly monopolised the attention we humans pay to matter. She continues, or is materiality more potent than that? Can political theory do a better job of recognising the active participation of non-human forces in every event and every stabilisation? Is there a form of theory that can acknowledge certain thing power? That is, the irreducibility of objects to the human meanings or agenda they also embody. Now I, Edith, stress at this point that I have no objection whatsoever to questioning anthropocentrism. The ecological crisis which we homines sapientes have afflicted on planet Earth demands that we change our exploitative and destructive behaviour towards all the things, animate and inanimate, with which we share the globe and the universe. But there is, however, a fundamental flaw in Bennett's premise that this exploitative and destructive history is connected with thinking about matter exclusively, her word is only, in terms of labour and socio-economics. The very idea that scholars of culture have already done a good enough job of thinking about labour is absolutely preposterous in my view. Only a scholar working in a country like the USA, where about 20% of the workforce is engaged in agriculture or industry and the other 80% operating at a more or less extreme degree of alienation from the processes of material production, only she could possibly hold such an opinion. In some European countries, the productive workers now constitute less than 5% of the working population. But try claiming that scholars are too focused on labour and a socio-economy to a citizen of Zambia or Burundi, where the percentage of the workforce labouring in agriculture or industry is 91 and 96% respectively. Globally, more than 40% of the workforce still works in farming of one kind or another, often at a subsistence level with scarcely any machinery and in abject poverty. And the classical world was, in terms of its relations to production, far more similar to modern Zambia and Burundi than it is to modern England or North America. If we're fully to appreciate the role of materials and objects in ancient thought, then we surely would be well advised to ask how those materials were thought about in that society, as well as their immanent vitality or thing power. What are we going to do with the label classics today, though, is a problem, not just because it's Eurocentric and bound up with the curriculum of empire, but because it's so intertwined with the history and vocabulary of class. Classics today, of course, denotes any iconic, archetypal or ideal example of a thing. Vintage cars can be classics, as can pop songs, novels or recipes. But classicists understand the term to refer to the cultural output, specifically of ancient Greece and Rome. And one reason for retaining the term could actually be that it's a perpetual reminder of the historic connection between socio-economic hierarchies, class, and the disparity between the cultural and imaginative lives of people in different classes. If handled sensitively, it actually helps us ask how classics has been used to maintain class distinctions, but also whether classics' elite connotations have been or must remain inevitable. More than one reviewer has, however, criticised Henry and me for not using the term class in the way that they want to understand it, for it's an even more contested term than classics. Everyone knows that class exists, but it's far less easy to identify and define than social stratifications based on gender, age or race. We were determined in particular to reveal the imprecision of the category popular culture, which thoroughly blurs and erases the true economic inequities from which such culture emerges. We read the history and uses and abuses of classical culture from a perspective that is explicitly conscious of the social class of the agents involved. But class in the sociological sense means two different things, although they are sometimes commensurate. Objective class is an economic category, while subjective class defines the way individuals and groups are perceived by themselves and others. Everyone has an objective class identity, in that everyone has a position in the economic workings of society. Everyone acquires their subsistence from somewhere. Everyone plays a role in the way that goods and services are consumed and distributed. Objective class analysis simply asks what the source of the subsistence and the role are. All the people in our historical period of study, and Henry's in my book, derived their basic subsistence from one or more sources, just as everyone does today, and as they did in antiquity, but matters are a bit more complex. Since the Industrial Revolution, there's been so much social confusion and mobility that precise subcategories of class, for example, upper proletariat, underclass, service sector, or lower middle white collar, can become very difficult to apply consistently. Paul Fussell's 1983 Classic Class Analysis, Class, A Guide Through the American Status System, proposes a 9-tier stratification of contemporary American society, ranging from the super-rich, who've amassed such large fortunes that their descendants need never work, through to no fewer than 5 discrete categories of low-class persons. In descending order, these are skilled blue-collar workers, workers in factories and the service industry, manual labourers, the destitute, unemployed and homeless, and the out-of-sight members of the population incarcerated in prisons and institutions. In The Stamp of Class, however, Ohio-born poet Gary Lenhart argues that class identities are much more fluid in the USA than in Europe. And in the USA, even more in the UK, the history of slavery means, of course, that categorisation by race is usually more visibly related to oppression than working occupation is. Yet despite the fluidity and complexity of the subcategories, there are still only 9 basic ways to acquire money to survive. Earn it, extract it legally from the labour of others, steal it, live off interest on capital or rent on property, inherit, win it or be given it with no strings attached, derive it from the state, derive it from charity, or be supported by another private individual, spouse, parent, lover, sponsor, patron, guardian. During the period covered by Henry's and my book, most people in Britain fell into the first or last categories, in that they earned their livelihood from physical labour, or they were financially dependent on someone who did. This means that they were objectively working class. But it's as a subjective definition, rather than socioeconomic role, that most people understand the term class today. Class position is often subjectively diagnosed or perceived from a whole cluster of identifying markers. And these range from style of speech and accent, hairstyle and clothing, to recreational tastes and educational attainments. The subjective markers of class, especially in the modern world, and wherever there is social mobility, are not always coextensive with objective class position. And classical reception, like most other academic disciplines, has hitherto neglected social class as a category of analysis. As the literary historian Stefan Collini has said in the Quartet of Race, Class and Gender and Sexual Orientation, there is no doubt that class has been the least fashionable, despite the fact that all the evidence suggests that class remains the single most important determinant of life chances. Chris Stray's Classics Transformed, Schools, Universities, Society in England, 1830 to 1960, albeit focused on school and university curricula, is a notable exception. It looks wonderfully at classics, but from the top-down elite perspective has influenced profoundly, as has Feroz Vazunia's study of the civil service and the Raj. So have literary studies of African American and Caribbean writers by Emily Greenwood, Patrice Rankin, Justin McConnell, as well as Michelle Ronick's marvellous work on African American classicists during the struggle against slavery and the postbellum period. And more recently, we've been influenced by Ellen Adams' pioneering work on disability studies and the classical body. A few important studies have addressed the role played by classics in social exclusion. Notably, François Waquet's Le Latin, or the Empire of a Sign, although her major focus was on the Renaissance and early modern periods, and she doesn't engage with working class perspectives. Now, one reason for the neglect of class-conscious research amongst scholars of classical reception is that many critics, especially in the USA and especially during the Cold War, have historically denied that class is even a legitimate category of analysis. They've attempted to argue that both class-conscious art and class-oriented criticism are reductive and partisan. Now, our response to this is that any study of human society and cultures which avoids class has to be limited and partial. It's surely the absence of any available study of working class instrumentalisation of ancient Greece and Rome until last year that allowed a prominent cultural historian to introduce a summation of 19th century classical presences with the unnuanced claim that the classics were responsible for more humbug than almost anything else in the Victorian age. The neglect is not solely a matter of fashion either. I leave you with Andrew Sayers' penetrating philosophical inquiry, The Moral Significance of Class. He's shown how scholars and students, like everyone else, display embarrassment, awkwardness, defensiveness, evasiveness, nervous judgment of others, or self-deprecation, and other signs of real unease when the topic of class is raised, even at the most abstract and analytical academic level. Most people don't even like making public what their own objective class position is in terms of what crystallised labour, how long ago, ultimately appears transmuted into numbers in their bank account. Class position, argues Sayre, is arbitrary, produces social injustices, yet is associated with an extensive set of moral discourses expressing evaluations. And these are imposed on behaviour, taste, industriousness, ethical standards, and perceived deservingness. Class, he says, is morally problematic because of its arbitrary relationship to worth, virtues, and status. That it is why it's a highly sensitive subject. We are shamed by class for one reason alone, because it is shameful. Thank you very much.